Hello, this is Mary Krakow, and you are listening to the webinar Addressing Problematic Employee Behaviors. Thank you for joining me today. A couple of housekeeping matters. For questions during the presentation, you will need to hover over the bottom of the screen to see the Q&A feature. And I think you can then type in your question. That will come to us. And my plan is to save a few minutes at the end to address your questions specifically at that time. Now, during the presentation, if the internet audio cuts out for you, please use the dial-in number that was provided. Also, we will send a follow-up email to everyone regarding continuing education credits if you need those. And I want to remind everyone that on December 19th, my colleagues Teresa Thompson and David Waits will be presenting a webinar entitled Protecting Your Company's Reputation Online. And you may sign up for that webinar at our website, fredlaw.com. So with those little housekeeping matters accomplished, we're going to get started with today's webinar. And again, welcome and thank you for joining me today. Of course, we all know that some work groups and departments are high functioning and productive. And then we have those work groups and departments that we will just say, oh, not so much. And what is the problem? What's the difference? Well, sometimes it's skill set. Actually, people in the department don't have the right vocational skills they need to do their jobs right. But those are the ones that are easier to address. The ones that are harder, sometimes called soft skills, are things like cooperation, contribution, accountability, etc. A destructive attitude can be one of those things. And, of course, really good departments generally have strong leadership. So when we don't have a good department, the problematic behaviors may be the reason. There is apathy, there's negativity, there's lack of cooperation, etc. And I'm not here today talking about the poor performance on the vocational skills or the poor attendance, because most people know how to address that pretty readily. I'm also not talking about the new hot topic in all of social media and all of our world today, which is harassing behavior, although some of the things we go over today, of course, apply to that kind of behavior as well. No, I'm talking more about what some people, again, typically refer to as soft skills. I'm referring to it in this webinar as problematic behavior. All right. And sometimes the problem with that, addressing it and fixing it, is that it can be subtle, subjective, it's difficult to quantify, it's difficult to address, and if we have poor leadership in a department or a work group, well, then for sure it's not getting addressed as it should. Our agenda for today, I'm going to go over some guidelines for managing and disciplining problematic employee behaviors. Hopefully most of that is very familiar to you. And then we're going to do examples, and at the end, as I said, you can be sending your questions and I will address those during the Q&A session. Also, I'm going to try to highlight 4 key takeaways as we go through the material today. And you may want to just jot those down as we go. Hopefully, too, you're following along with the PowerPoint that was available to you as part of your registration. You also should have had available to you an outline, which includes a bit more information, and if you will have that handy and can look at that as we go, that's great, or you can look at that at another time. First, a couple cautions. I have to say, I don't think there are so-called magic answers that work in all instances for all problematic employee behavior. There is more than one way to address it, and here's another big caveat. Sometimes the problem is cultural, either department-wide or even company-wide, and the problem is something that is going to take help from more than just one supervisor or one person in HR trying to make it better. And I've certainly received questions from my clients on situations like that. But I always say it is worth trying. And that's really my takeaway number one. Don't ignore problematic behavior. You've got to try to make the workplace better. And I would say, be encouraged. You know, most people may be, at least some may be, unaware of how their behaviors are affecting others. I can think of a few people I know, they don't have a clue about, you know, what they say and what they do and how it affects others around them. And if brought to their attention, people want to do better. They don't want to offend people. They don't want to be irritating to people, and they will change and improve through coaching, training, practice, etc. Now, why are these kinds of the behaviors that I'm talking about today, why don't they get addressed? Well, sometimes it's because it's hard to articulate what is the issue here. In my experience, in order to address behavior, in order to get change behavior, we first have to identify it and we have to name it to do that. But I always encourage people, be sensitive, don't try to shame people. That doesn't help anything. And how do you avoid shaming people when we're talking about behaviors? Well, we emphasize the conduct, not the person. When doing so, of course, we always have to be aware of potential legal claims that could come out of how we address things or what's happening. And the big three, you probably know these, right? Discrimination, retaliation, breach of contract. Discrimination claims come when we're treating people with the same kind of problematic behaviors differently. The key word there, of course, is consistency. That's HR knows that very well. Retaliation. Don't discipline somebody close in time after legally protected activity. If you do, that looks like you're now retaliating against the person. And of course, then breach of contract can be a problem. And that's if you have a policy, you have a practice of following progressive discipline, then you need to follow it. Now, we don't recommend progressive discipline because we think every situation should be addressed on its facts. Always, though, being careful about not discriminating, not retaliating. But if you have progressive discipline, that's not wrong. That's fine. You just have to be sure you follow your policy or follow your practice. All right. So moving right along, what we're really talking about is the frontline managers and supervisors who have to address the employee behaviors. I don't know how many first-line managers or supervisors I have on the line with me today, but if I do, you all are the ones who really can benefit from some of this information. I think companies fail in this regard as far as helping supervisors and managers address problematic behaviors because the supervisors and managers have not been trained appropriately. Train, train, and train. And then part of their performance eval needs to be how effectively are they dealing with employee behaviors in their work group, in their department. And just to emphasize my point about training, I say train early, train often, and do it repeated. You'll never train too much. And that really is my second key takeaway today. If you want your supervisors, you want your managers to be able to build a good work group globally, both their work skills and their behaviors, etc. You got to train them to how to do that. The other thing I think that sometimes companies miss that can be helpful is the role of peer-to-peer behavior management, also called team pressure. Now, I don't have any magic wand on that one. What is it, how to create it, how to use it without causing more and even bigger problems. But one of the things I have noticed is usually it has to be the result of team-driven rules and process, not just individual employees, but as a team, as a work group, as a department, the people have together sat down and determined what we could call healthy behaviors in our work group and list all those, and then what are the unhealthy behaviors in our work group and list all those. And you can even publish the list so that immediately when someone is engaging in one of those unhealthy behaviors, it empowers other employees to either say something or to at least, give a look perhaps that, this is not the kind of behavior we want in our work group. And I actually have seen that work really well in some teams, departments, and so forth. But of course, you got to have the support from the top down to implement that kind of procedure and process and then enforce it. All right, so address the problematic behavior usually close in time to when it occurs. Of course, you've got to pick your battles. Not every problematic behavior needs to be addressed, but my takeaway number 3 is don't wait. That usually makes things worse. And how do you judge if a behavior needs to be addressed or not? Of course, 2 ways I think you can do that is to ask, is the behavior hurtful to others? And if it is, then it needs to be addressed. Or does the behavior interfere with the work process, the department's goals and objectives, etc. If either of those 2 are happening, yeah, that's a battle you need to pick and you need to address. So what do we do when we have problematic behaviors? Well, potential responses are the usual. You know these. Unfortunately, the first, the do nothing, gets used way too often based on what I hear about. But others are the verbal coaching, and we don't document it. The verbal warning, we do document that. Written warning, unpaid suspension, demotion, or maybe some kind of reassignment. All right. You also can withhold a raise. You can require training, either internally or from an external expert. A potential response is verbal or written apologies. I don't hear about those too often. And I wonder why. One of the things I think is because we've gotten totally into this habit of people saying when they do something wrong, or they say something wrong, whatever, they respond with, oh, my bad. And I'm always wondering, yeah, well, my bad, what does that mean? If you really are sorry for what you just said or did, maybe you could say, oh, I'm sorry, I apologize, that kind of thing. But again, those can be tricky in the work setting, and maybe that's why people don't do it as often as they could or should. Termination, ultimate discipline, obviously. Always with discipline needs to be proportionate to the bad conduct. Parents know this, right? We only discipline proportionate to the bad behavior. And again, need not be progressive unless you've otherwise promised that. All right, so I've talked about things generally. Let's go back and dive into a couple of them more specifically. I want to talk about this doing nothing piece. That's the easy way out, and it happens way too often. I think it's a result of poor training, and I also think it's a result of some supervisors and managers do not like conflict. And then when I hear that, and I back up and I think about that for just a half minute, then I'm thinking, oh, for heaven's sakes, why are you in the position as a supervisor, as a manager? If you don't like conflict, I think you're in the wrong job, really, truly, because you're going to have conflict. You work with people, and people tend to have conflicts arise from time to time. But the big thing, too, about doing nothing is this. It causes co-workers to be unhappy, and I think it also leads to the department and the work group being dysfunctional. Just to throw in an example, one of my sisters who works in a large health organization, she used to work at a different large health organization, and she would tell me stories about her coworkers and what they did, and it was problematic within my definition. And she would say, well, Mary, why don't they do something? The supervisor just doesn't do anything. Well, as it turns out, as she was telling me the stories all the time, I could tell this supervisor had, 1, no training, and 2, obviously didn't like conflict. But what did that mean? Well, for my sister, she just got tired of it, and she left, and she found a new job. And they lost a really, really good employee in that instance, at least for what I can tell of how my sister works and so forth. And she just got fed up with it. And that's, I think, a huge risk when supervisors and managers do nothing. All right. Verbal coaching, of course, that helps educate an employee and may help the employee make helpful changes. Often that's a curbside kind of conversation, and it usually should be private, away from others. Of course, you can do one-on-one training and coaching, either someone at the workplace or from an external expert. Once in a while, maybe more often than any company would like, that external expert would be really helpful so that the problematic employee would get an objective viewpoint from the outsider. Of course, the confidentiality parameters must be determined and followed. If you do the written warning as needed, make it proportionate to the continued problematic behavior, as we've talked about. You know, a written warning can be first. You don't have to do the other things, but often it does follow either coaching or verbal. Now, if you do the written warning, what kind of documentation is it? Well, I've got here emails, follow-up memos, discipline memos, performance improvement plans, performance reviews. And of course, written documentation to the employee when there is a problem is critical. That's my takeaway number 4 for you today. You can't skip the written documentation. Lots of supervisors want to. It's hard to get to. Maybe they don't know what they're doing exactly. And it takes time away from the substantive work of the department. But it really does need to happen. Now, a question I get very often is, what about supervisors and managers keeping their own personal notes that do not go to the employee or even HR? Well, that's okay. You can create those, you can keep those, but here's the caveat. It's always subject to legal discovery. So never ever, and can I say that again? Never ever write anything down, even in your own personal notes, that you do not want the world to read. Because if there's ever a legal claim, those notes are going to become an exhibit. And even sometimes we have to find out about those if an employee asks for their personnel record here in Minnesota under the personnel record statute, and we have to produce those to the employee. So don't write anything that you're not going to want even the employee to read at some point. So what kind of documentation, when you do documentation, who are you writing it for? Well, of course, you're writing it for the employee as the primary audience. But don't forget your secondary audiences, like potentially the employee's lawyer, maybe the EEOC, the Department of Human Rights, the Department of Labor, National Labor Relations Board. All of those could be reading what you wrote at some point down the line if things go badly here and there's a legal claim, and a judge or a jury. Documentation, I have found, lots of companies have a formal template that they use, and that's fine. Those can be really helpful, in fact, to help supervisors know what types of information to include. And it will be the facts, the reason the behavior is a problem, expectations going forward, and then always, always, always consequences if there is no change. A couple of things I've realized over the years is that on the documentation, be careful not to use industry jargon or abbreviations unless you first define. And I'll just tell you my little issue with abbreviations. I work with a lot of healthcare groups, and they like to abbreviate for the words follow up. I'll not tell you what those letters are. You can figure it out, right? And that's a perfectly fine abbreviation. But I got to tell you, every time I read it, even still after all these years, I got to double think what that abbreviation really is referring to. Follow up. And of course, if you are healthcare, you can't put in any PHI. Also, always be careful of labels. Team player, that seems fine to most of us, but the EEOC has said, oh, well, that's not a good one because it can be a pseudonym for you are not like me. You do not look like me. So they think it may be a pseudonym for discriminatory labeling. Bad attitude, Well, that one just doesn't help too often, and it may give rise to a retaliation claim because maybe the person reported some legally protected activity before. Set in your ways, that communicates age. Resistance to change, same thing. Now the one, that's millennial behavior. I don't really hear that, but referring to millennials has become kind of one of those things that people think is a stereotype and should be avoided. Also, be careful. Do not diagnose people with, trying to figure out what is their mental health malady. No. You don't need to diagnose. You want to coach for behavior. You do not need to counsel. And also be careful, though. Don't ignore information that shows a possible medical impairment. Of course, I'm not talking about the Americans with Disabilities Act today and the reasonable accommodation obligation, but you can't ignore info that an employee shares with you that may suggest a possible medical impairment for their problematic behavior. Instead, you need to engage in the interactive process. I've given you some language here that you may want to use to try to find out if there's something more that we need to do. All right. In summary, guidelines, keep trying with individuals and the team. Be cautious. Use incremental steps if those are appropriate. Document everything, of course, and do not tolerate failure to improve for too long. That's kind of a process, all right? So now let's turn to some examples and see how the process may work with the examples. And for each, I'm going to be talking about what is the problematic behavior, should the supervisor address, if yes, when, where, should the supervisor not just address it, but actually discipline, what documentation should be created, and here's a key question, I think. What could have happened earlier to prevent the problematic behavior? Wouldn't it be nice to prevent problematic behavior whenever we could instead of having to deal with it after it has occurred? And of course, that means the manager, the supervisor have to be proactive. All right, so jumping right in, you have the examples written out in a little more detail in the outline, but we'll just cover the main parts here. All right. Oh, and by the way, all of these examples are taken from real life questions that clients have asked me. Of course, I've tweaked it a little bit here and there because I don't want the client to immediately recognize their problem. But I can't make these up, people. These are real life things, okay? So, example one, department. There's a meeting of 10 people, and everybody's sharing helpful suggestions, but then all of a sudden, employee A states emphatically to the group, well, some people are not pulling their weight. Employee B jumps up and angrily states, well, that's, you see the letters there, and you know what those mean, you're the problem. And employee A and others are visibly upset by what employee B just said. Definitely some problematic behavior here from, I think, both employee A and employee B. And should the supervisor address it right there at the meeting? I say yes. And the reason I say yes is because others saw it, others heard it. Now, you don't have to do the full talk with either, but you got to do something. And here's some sample language. With employee A, you certainly are entitled to your opinion, but please always be careful to remember our core values. And of course, hopefully one of the core values of the company, or at least the department, is be respectful to our colleagues. And then I think the supervisor could say to employee A, I will discuss more with you later. Okay, that's employee A. But here's employee B. There's the one who responded with, that's, you know what, and you're a part of the problem. Well, I think the supervisor should say to employee B something like, you too certainly are entitled to your opinion, but however, you got to express your opinion in an appropriate manner, and your response just now, that was not appropriate. So I'll talk to you later. Please meet me in my office at such and such time. All right? Now, when talking with employee B, we'll talk about that one, again, explain why the outburst was not appropriate. Will you give a written warning? Well, maybe. Depends on what's happened before with employee B. Or if you think that the behavior was egregious enough to go to a written warning right away for this first time, bad, problematic behavior. And if you're going to do a written warning, write it out, discuss it with employee B, and you have employee B sign. All right? Always employees should be asked to sign any kind of written warning, and you put the original in the employee's file and you give a copy to the employee. And if the employee refuses to sign, hopefully you know the thing that you can write at the bottom, presented to and discussed with employee B on, fill in the date, employee refused to sign. Gave copy to employee. Something like that, a notation that will help set the record regarding what happened if ever needed at a later time. All right, let's just keep going here. Example 2, so totally different company. When I say employee A, it's not the same employee A from example 1, different company. Here employee A fashions him or herself as the jokester in the department. And honestly, this person pushes the boundaries of acceptability with his or her jokes. But nobody has yet complained. However, even though some of the coworkers are uncomfortable with some of the jokes. But now here today, employee 8 tells a bathroom humor joke. I'll just leave it there. And a coworker doesn't like the joke and loudly states to employee A, you know, that joke is inappropriate. You need to stop. All right, employee A is stopped right in his or her tracks, but gives what I call a looks could kill stare to the coworker who spoke up, walks out of the room, and never says anything to the coworker again. Well, what's the result of that? Employee A won't talk to the coworker about a work problem that they really need to work on together. And it's only after this whole work problem is out of control that the supervisor learns of the incident that had happened several weeks before. All right. So the big question here was, well, should the supervisor address what had happened weeks before now that she's finally learning about it? And my advice was, oh, yes, absolutely. You've got to go back and you've got to investigate that to find out, well, what happened there? Well, all right, the supervisor does, and she learns that, yep, employee A was telling a bathroom humor joke that really was inappropriate. I'm not even going to tell you all the details of that joke because this is a real life case. And the coworker stood up and told her that's inappropriate. You got to stop. All right. So should employee A be disciplined? And I said yes, with a written warning, likely for the joke and for then ignoring the coworker, because the supervisors asked employee A about that too. You know, what is the deal? What's happening with the coworkers? Now, here's the other question. What should happen with the coworker who stood up? Remember, I said peer-to-peer pressure can be good. What should happen with the coworker who stood up and said, that joke's inappropriate, you need to stop? Well, I think the supervisor needs to talk with her too, obviously, as part of the investigation, but make it bigger than this one episode. Are there other problems with work getting done? Find out about her response to the work environment and document as part of the investigation. And then, of course, we're asking, is there anything else to be done? And my encouragement is this. There were more people than employee A and the coworker in the workspace where all of this happened. I think the supervisor with a higher up manager or HR needs to develop some kind of response or approach to communicate to others in that work group the inappropriateness of that kind of joke telling in the workplace, and the response to the coworker who stood up and said that joke's inappropriate, you need to stop, that kind of thing. Everybody was there. I think this is an opportunity for us to help mold and frame what the people in the work group understand is appropriate behavior and is not. Another lesson to be learned from this example is this: even if you, as a supervisor or HR, you learn of a problem after the fact, it's been several weeks, maybe even months, which would be a problem. But if it's after the fact, don't ignore it. You may have to go back, likely you do, and find out what happened, put the pieces together, and then take appropriate corrective action proportionate to the situation. All right, moving right along, example 3, different company again. Here we have employee A. Employee A holds a high, very specialized position, which is very important to the company's success. The person does not supervise any others. However, he does interact, or she interacts with others often, and is demanding, impatient, and demeaning. This company does not curb this employee A's subversive jerk behavior. Now, before we even go any further, I always wonder about this. You know, what's the deal with this employee A? I think it's kind of a chicken and egg issue. Because do people like this who are really want to be jerks naturally rise to the top with very important, high specialized positions so they can be a jerk to everybody? Or does it happen the other way? They're in a very high, very specialized position, and then they figure out, well, I'm so important here, I can be a jerk to everybody. I don't have to work cooperatively or collaboratively with others. Well, we're not going to answer that question here today, I realize, but it's interesting to try to figure out, why does this happen? You know, do those jerks just rise to the top or what? What's going on here? All right, but going on with the example. New employee B. Now, employee B is at a meeting with employee A and others, and employee A zeroes in on this new employee B, making demeaning demands. You know, and you can kind of picture this, I'm guessing. Others are sitting around in the meeting, they're listening, but employee A is going off on employee B, not them. And besides, they've been here long enough. They just are thinking to themselves, oh yeah, well, that's employee A. That's his or her normal self. And the supervisor does nothing. If you've had this situation, you know what I'm talking about. And more companies than I think want to admit have had this. Now, but employee B is not having any of this. Employee B immediately leaves the meeting and marches down to HR and reports this as a hostile work environment. Now, hostile work environment can mean a lot of things. Often in the law, it means that we've got legally prohibited conduct because it's about my race, it's about my gender, it's about my sexual orientation, it's about my religion. That's legally protected and legally prohibited behavior. You can't be a jerk to me because of those things. But here, I'm trying to set up this example to show, no, employee A is just a jerk to everybody. But may I just emphasize here that if we have to, as the employer, defend this matter, if there's a legal claim, with what I call the equal opportunity jerk defense, employee A, he's just an equal opportunity jerk to everybody, we'll probably lose. That one just doesn't win the day. So what should HR do now that employee B, new person, has come to HR and reported the problem? Well, got to talk to employee B, got to talk to employee A, got to talk to the supervisor, talk to others in the meeting. And what to do about the supervisor? Well, obviously, and I'm talking about the supervisor now, not employee A, the jerk. I'm talking about the supervisor. Obviously, the supervisor has failed in his or her role as a leader. And should the supervisor be disciplined? Well, I think that's a case by case, because I'm going to find out first, well, how much training has the supervisor had? And if the supervisor hasn't had the proper training, then that's what needs to happen, and maybe not discipline. All right, but what about employee A, who engages in the jerk behavior? Written discipline, or potentially worse, maybe there's an unpaid suspension, maybe there's even a termination. But for sure, what we need is immediate and sustained improvement. And if there is none, then further discipline. And then here's the thing: train, train, and train. And likely this is a situation where we got to bring in an outside trainer to really deal with employee A and what's going on. All right, and then this example gives me an opportunity to say, don't forget about following up with employee B. Following up with the complainer is a key component to any report where you have to do an investigation or fact-finding. And some of the things you want to be sure to do: thank employee B for coming forward, report to employee B that the company has taken action, ask employee B to report any additional concerns, and then check in with employee B periodically. I actually have a case on my desk right now where the reason we're getting a legal claim in that case is the company did not periodically check in with employee B to find out, how are things going? Is it all going okay? If not, what can we, tell us about that? We'll see what we can do. Check in with employee B, the reporter, the complainer. All right, new example, different company, of course. Supervisor holds department meetings. Many ask questions, but here's employee A. Employee A sits at the far end of the table, positions his or her chair so the supervisor cannot easily see him or her, crosses the arms over his chest, and as I said, sits away from the table. What's the problem here? Hasn't said a word. Well, it's the body language, and everybody in the room sees it. Everybody in the room sees it. That's a problem, because it's communicating a lot. Now, and then I add, when asked any questions, he answers with a snippy, nope, no questions. Now, here's my question to all of you. Should the supervisor address this employee A's behavior during the meeting and in front of others, or wait and do it privately? And my answer is likely not in front of others, but yes, away from the meeting. And here's the difference before. Is it hurtful to others? Well, not really. The behavior of employee A, it's not really hurtful to others other than the supervisor. And is it hurtful to the department or getting the work done? Well, not so much. That's why I want to say do it away from the meeting. Although, judgment call here, big judgment call. And this is where I say, you know what? Supervisors need to be able to read the room, know the people in the meeting. If I reprimand verbally employee A for this body language that says, I don't care about your meeting, I don't care what you're telling me, I'm not listening to you, will others in the room support me, the supervisor, or will they side with employee A? Supervisors have to be sensitive to that. So if I don't know, I'm going to meet privately with employee A, and I'm going to do so in a very calm manner, and I'm going to go through things like, I had a difficult time making eye contact, any reason for avoiding me, etc. You can read those, any reason you did not contribute, understand all the new technology, and just feed back to the employee A what I understood. And one of the things I would, as supervisor, I would say, we all need to remember that tone communicates intention. And if his tone was snippy and short, well, that's the intention we all are understood from him. Which gives me an opportunity to say, as kind of a side note, that's why email and text messaging, not such good methods of communication when you have hard things to communicate to people, because if you read an email, you read a text from somebody else, whose voice do you hear in your head? Well, I think you hear your own. So you are going to give it the tone that you think it communicates, not necessarily the same tone that the writer was communicating. Just an observation. All right, and then going forward, tell the person, I need your participation, I need you to use the correct tone of voice, and you're going to do follow-up with the facts, et cetera, you can read this, and that will be the close for example 4. And of course, always say, please let me know of any questions. All right, now we're going to do example 5 pretty fast. I'm going to go through all of the parts, and then we're going to come back and figure out what you could have, should have, would have done. This is employee A, new person, tells her coworkers and the supervisor that her former employer's procedures were better. Well, that's really negative, not very good for creating goodwill with her department members. And her tone of voice is almost always snippy and harsh when she talks to the coworkers and supervisor. But here's the deal. Her tone of voice and negative comments continue, but she's really warm and friendly with the customers and gives exemplary customer service, and she even got a thank you note praising her for her good work with the customer. All right, then we've got a mandatory Saturday morning meeting at a different company site than where employee A typically worked. All right, employee A had traveled there 4, 5, 6 times. She knew where to go, but she missed the meeting. She didn't call in, and then she later said, oh, I got lost. I got lost. And then finally, part 5, which is a real kicker here. She doesn't get any coaching or discipline from the supervisor because that supervisor doesn't like conflict. And then everybody just excuses her. That's just her kind of deal. And now it's 10 months later, and the department needs to be trimmed down as far as staff goes because they got too many because of new technology. We don't need everybody. And the supervisor wants to select employee A. Well, of course you want to get rid of employee A. She's the problem. But the deal is, should you? All right, now this is cheating. We know where we want to be at the end. So let's go back and see what we should do. And of course, that's the deal always. We always have to be thinking about, okay, well, if I don't take action now and we get down 3 months, 6 months down the road and I didn't do anything for today's behavior, how is that going to help me or hurt me with any kind of possible scenarios 3 or 6 months later? Well, I'm giving you an example here. Let's go back. Part 1, she tells others that her former employer's procedures were better than the company's. What should we do? Well, we might do nothing. It's kind of premature to coach. It's not really terrible. And besides, maybe that former employer's procedures were better. Could have been. So you could just do it as a kind of coaching. What were those procedures? Why do you think they were better? And use it as a learning opportunity. But what about that snippy, harsh tone toward coworkers and the supervisor? It's still not really terrible. You might do nothing, but I don't think I'd ignore it. I would do it with others present because they've heard it too. And I would just say, we always want to be respectful, calm, kind. That's my tone of voice with her, and I would emphasize that when I'm talking with her about how she speaks to coworkers, and her tone of voice is harsh and snippy, and ask her what she thinks. Could she be less snippy like that, and so on. And just emphasize that whole bit about how tone communicates disrespect and even hostility and so on. And just see if that's enough to wake her up and have her do better. Now, if you're doing all of that, of course, and as I said in the earlier slide, you would not do that in front of others. You could raise just the beginning part of that with her in front of others, but all the rest of it, do it away from the others. Okay, and then you're going to do documentation, either an email or a memo summary. If it's not really discipline, you don't have to have her sign it, but you still would put the original in her file and make sure she gets a copy. Now, her negative comments continue, but then she goes the extra mile with the customers. One customer writes a thank you and so forth. And you're like, as a supervisor, oh, good grief. The customer tells her thank you, and we're just putting up with all this snippy, hostile kind of tone of voice and communication? Well, so should you ignore what the customer said and did? And my answer is no, 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 no. In private, use this as an opportunity to coach. You know, recognize that she got this customer thank you and ask her why she thinks the customer did that. And then go back to, well, I still perceive that your tone with coworkers and me is entirely different. And why the difference? And so on and so on. So that you use it as an opportunity for coaching, and you'll follow up with an email or a memo summary to the employee. All right, now you've got this Saturday morning meeting. She's been there before. She doesn't show up. Later on, she says she got lost. Okay, do you believe that? I don't. I know I'm kind of cynical these days, but I don't believe that for a half minute. She knew where she was supposed to be. She just wasn't going to go. So should the supervisor address this? Absolutely. You're going to meet with her. You're going to find out the details. And at minimum, there's going to be a follow-up email or memo that's going to go to her and to her file, maybe even a written warning. Now we're 10 months later, though, and the supervisor needs to cut staff. Can we cut her? And the answer, of course, you're all ahead of me on this one, I'm quite certain. No, not without documentation of coaching, verbal warning, written warnings, and then with appropriate documentation, maybe you can. This is a real life example. It didn't go on for 10 months. It went on for 10 years with my client, with this particular employee who was just a problem forever. And then they did get to a point where they needed to cut staff in the department, and they cut her, even though by then she was 60-some years old and the oldest, and she filed an age discrimination claim. And our defense was she was the problematic employee. Her soft skills were little to zero, and they had documentation, really good documentation from the supervisors over the years that spoke to the issues of her, how she treated others, she missed meetings, et cetera, and we prevailed on that claim. So it can be done even with this problematic kind of behavior. One last example real quickly. Here we have employee A, totally different employee A. Several instances of problematic behavior. The supervisor has coached once, but no documentation. Then coworkers complain, and finally the supervisor realizes, you know what, I got to meet with employee A. I'm going to get a written warning together. I'm going to meet with her. Does that and starts to explain the ongoing problems. And before she gets even very far in, employee A interrupts, stands up, and says, well, then I should just quit. I quit. And the question is, what should the supervisor do? Well, I think generally you should do this. You should say, well, okay. You don't have to be real enthusiastic about it, but you could say, I'm not asking you to quit, but okay. I will have HR process your separation effective today. We'll get you your final check. Do you have a company security card? I'm going to need that. And I'll box up your things and we'll send them to you, or we'll arrange a time later for you to get your things from your office, your cubicle, whatever it is. So when an employee offers to resign, of course you can emphasize, well, we're not asking you to resign, but I don't think you want to try to talk the person out of it. That might be the one gift you get that day. So some takeaways that we've talked about. One, do not ignore the problem. Problematic behavior, don't ignore it. It generally only gets worse. Do train your managers and supervisors on how to address, but make sure they're trained to pick their battles. And then, of course, follow the usual and appropriate disciplinary processes and good documentation techniques and processes. All right, now I'm going to try to do some of your questions. This one says, given your example 2, so let's all turn to example 2. That's the jokester example, all right? If the supervisor learns of the behaviors from another employee not involved in the situation, is your recommendation the same in how to handle the situation? How does the supervisor handle the employee that came to the supervisor with the information? Well, that's a very good question. Well, and I think that's a good thing. that somebody else in the department thought it important enough to make sure the supervisor knows about what happened. Now, when we were children, of course, we might have labeled this other employee the tattletale of the classroom. Well, I just think that concept does not apply in the workplace. Of course, employees need firsthand knowledge of what they're reporting, or pretty good secondhand knowledge, if in fact that's what it is. But this would be the firsthand knowledge. Another employee who was involved in the situation. Well, I think the supervisor should get all of the reporters' information and then should set out on fact gathering in the same way you would for most kind of reports from employees, which is get yourself a plan. What am I going to do here? Am I the right person to do the fact-finding follow-up? You can call it investigation. And if the HR person is the right person to follow up, or no, here it's the supervisor. The supervisor probably needs to bring in HR. Most supervisors don't want to do fact-finding follow-up, I've learned. Now, if you have a really good supervisor who does, that's fine. But most supervisors want to get HR involved, and I think that's appropriate, especially, you have to have HR, and most companies do. And then HR will devise the plan for the follow-up. And who's going to do the follow-up? Who do we all talk to? It'll be obviously the jokester person, and then the other person who stood up, the coworker who stood up and said that's inappropriate. And then let's learn what happened. And then, yep, we're going to figure out what is appropriate response and proportionate to what has happened. Here's the next question is, can you repeat the third key takeaway in the presentation? And my third key takeaway is pick your battles, but don't ignore the behavior, which is kind of like number one, which is don't ignore problematic behavior. But it's just emphasizing that, we all have to use good judgment. We pick our battles. We determine what needs follow-up, etc. That was third. All right. This question is, in a union environment, should informal coachings be documented? My answer to that is, yeah, you should still document informal coaching, although I will want to add a caveat to that because I don't do work with unions. Other colleagues here at Frederickson and Byron in the employment department do that. But I don't know why you would not document informal coaching. At least as the supervisor, you want to document it, create your own notes that you keep. If it's not formal discipline under the collective bargaining agreement, but have your own notes, you keep it. And again, please, please, please never write anything you don't want the world to read. Here's a good question. For healthcare, all of you in healthcare out there, in regards to not using PHI in write-ups, can we use the date of service and date of birth to refer to the incident? Well, technically you could, because all of those two things, date of birth and date of service, do not communicate any PHI. My encouragement to my healthcare clients, and actually other clients who have confidential customer information that is part of the problematic behavior that's happened and that has to be addressed, you got to figure out some kind of methodology to refer to the actual incident and who was involved without including in the write-up to the employee the PHI or the confidential customer name and information. So it's not just healthcare that has this issue. And it could be, some code words. It could be just that the actual incident is, and the customer names are not being included in this employee write-up, so that confidentiality of the patient or confidentiality of the customer can be protected. That information will be available only within the confidential parameters, etc. So figure out a way to do that separately. All right. Oh, yeah. I love this question because this is typically what happens. Here it is. Well, what if that employee who quit, in my example 6 was it, changes her mind after you accepted? You have nothing in writing. Well, yeah, that can be an issue and it happens. But remember, you don't have to get resignations in writing. You don't have to get a quit in writing. You can, but when you push that to get it in writing, sometimes the person backs away from it. The better way is sometimes for you as the employer to write up, this memo confirms that Jane Smith resigned her employment on December 14th, 2008 or 17. And then you have a place where Jane Smith can sign it, and you can sign it as the witness. And you would write that up right there while she's telling you, I quit. Now, she may even refuse to sign it then, but I would just say back to her, okay, you don't want to sign this, but you did tell me that you want to quit. So I'm going to process this as a quit. And she leaves, and then she emails you later, or she calls up later. Well, I think every situation like that is case by case, because if you have not taken any action to post the position, to interview for the position, to hire somebody new, so that if you don't let the first person renege on her resignation, you're going to cause harm to a second person, somebody that already has been interviewed, somebody who's already been offered a job. You know, you can't renege after you've already gone down the path and offered the job to somebody new. But if you're not there, so there's really no harm to anybody else if the first employee who said, I resign, says, well, I didn't really mean to resign. I just was upset, so I'm coming back. Case by case decision there. I don't think you have to let the person come back, but if you choose to, you likely can do that unless, of course, as I just said, it would harm somebody else by letting the first person renege on her resignation. And you're saying, well, Mary, can't you give me more details, more specifics? And you know, I really cannot. It's case by case decision. You may want to make a quick call to your lawyer to talk through the issues and to identify what legal risks are on each side of that equation, and then make an informed decision based on all of the information available. Well, those are all the questions I have. I want to thank you all again for joining me today. I hope it's been beneficial for you. And I would just remind you again that the next employment webinar will be on December 19th, Protecting Your Company's Reputation Online, presented by my colleagues Teresa Thompson and David Waits. And you can register for that webinar by going onto the fredlaw.com website. Again, thank you, and I wish everyone happy holidays. Bye for now.